beautiful place, 3 stories, original hardwood floors, and all those classic architectural details you see in old homes. His parents got it for a steal because it had been on the market for over a year. The previous owners had moved out suddenly, but the realtor never explained why. He got the basement bedroom because he was the oldest of 3 kids and his parents thought he'd appreciate having his own space away from his younger brothers. The basement was partially finished, carpeted floor, painted walls, but you could still see the old stone foundation in some areas. It had this musty smell that his mom tried to cover up with air fresheners, but it never really went away. The first few weeks were normal. He loved the privacy, being able to play music without bothering anyone, having friends over without little brothers getting in the way. But after about a month, weird things started happening. He'd wake up and find his desk chair moved, not drastically, just turned slightly or pulled out from the desk. At first, he figured maybe he was forgetting how he left it, or maybe the old house was just settling. Old houses do that, right? Then his snacks started disappearing. He kept a stash of granola bars and chips in his desk drawer, and they'd vanish overnight. When he asked his brothers about it, they swore they never came down to the basement. And honestly, his parents believed them because both little brothers were scared of that basement. They said it gave them the creeps. The missing food situation escalated quickly. He'd buy a bag of chips, eat some after school, and by morning the entire bag would be gone. His mom accused him of sleep eating, which was ridiculous. So he started keeping a mental inventory of everything in his room, just to prove he wasn't losing his mind. Then came the night in November that changed everything. He woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. Walking past his desk, he noticed his laptop was open. The screen was still glowing, showing his desktop. But here's the thing, he always shut his laptop before bed. Always. His dad had drilled into him that leaving electronics on would run up the electric bill. He checked the browsing history, thinking maybe he'd used it and somehow forgotten. Someone had been watching YouTube videos. Specifically, videos of people sleeping. Hours and hours of them. The search history showed queries like people sleeping soundly and bedroom night sounds. His blood ran cold. He ran upstairs and woke up his parents. His dad came down to check the basement, but they didn't find anything unusual. All the windows were still locked, no sign of forced entry. He changed the Wi-Fi password just in case someone outside was somehow accessing their network, but deep down, he knew someone had been physically using that laptop. The next day, he set up his phone to record while he slept. He propped it up on the bookshelf, aimed it at his bed, and let it record all night. When he checked the footage the next morning, he nearly threw up. Around 2:30 a.m., a section of the stone wall behind his headboard slid open like a hidden door. A man crawled out looking thin, probably in his 40s, with long greasy hair and a scraggly beard. He was wearing dirty clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. For about 20 minutes, he just stood there, watching him sleep. Then he went to his desk, ate some of his snacks, and used his laptop. At one point, he walked over to his bed and stood right next to him for what felt like forever on the recording. Just watching him breathe. Before dawn, he crawled back through the wall and slid the panel closed. You couldn't even tell there was an opening there. He was shaking so hard he could barely hold his phone. He ran upstairs and showed his parents the video. His dad immediately called the police while his mom packed a bag for him to stay at his grandmother's house. When the police arrived, they found the hidden panel behind the bed. It led to a narrow space between the walls, not quite a room, but enough space for someone to live in if they were desperate enough. There was a sleeping bag, empty food containers, a portable camping toilet, and dozens of photos. They also found journals. Pages and pages of entries about his family, his schedules, and specifically about our storyteller. He wrote about how he reminded him of his daughter who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. He convinced himself that he was protecting him by watching over him while he slept. The man turned out to be the previous owner's uncle, who had been living in the wall space even before they moved in. That's why the family sold the house so suddenly. They discovered him but thought he'd left when they moved out. He'd actually been hiding in the walls the entire time the house was empty, and just continued living there after the new family moved in. He'd been using an entrance through the basement's exterior wall, behind some overgrown bushes. The police found that he'd been stealing food from several neighbors and had even broken into a few houses when families were on vacation. They moved out that same week. Chris couldn't sleep in that house another night, and honestly, his parents didn't blame him. The man was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, stalking, and a bunch of other crimes. He was clearly mentally ill and got court-ordered treatment, but that didn't make anyone feel any better. To this day, he can't sleep in basement bedrooms. Every house he's lived in since, he checks for any unusual panels or openings in the walls. And you know what? That's not paranoia. That's experience. This happened to my older brother Jake when he was 25 and working as a security guard at a warehouse complex outside Tucson. It was one of those jobs where you mostly just sit in a booth all night, make your rounds every couple of hours, and try to stay awake. The pay was decent for basically doing nothing, and Jake needed the money to save up for trade school. The warehouse complex had about 6 different buildings spread across maybe 15 acres. During the day, it was busy with trucks coming and going, workers loading and unloading, normal business activity. But at night, Jake was completely alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. His routine was simple: check in with his supervisor by radio every 2 hours, walk a patrol around all the buildings once during the night, and otherwise just monitor the security cameras from the main office. The cameras covered all the entrances and the parking areas, so he could see if anyone tried to enter the property. For the first month, nothing unusual happened. Occasionally a coyote would trigger a motion sensor, or a delivery truck would arrive early and he'd have to direct them to wait until morning. Standard stuff. But in his second month, Jake started noticing a pattern on the security footage. On some nights, he'd see a figure walking across one of the far parking lots. It was always the same person, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. The figure would walk slowly from one side of the lot to the other, then disappear off camera. At first, Jake thought it might be a homeless person cutting through the property. The warehouse complex backed up to a residential area, so it would make sense for someone to use it as a shortcut. But the person never tried to break into any buildings or cause trouble, so Jake didn't worry about it too much. Then one night, Jake was doing his patrol around 1 a.m. when he found something that made his skin crawl. Behind Building C, in an area not covered by cameras, someone had set up what looked like a small campsite. There was a tarp stretched between 2 dumpsters, creating a makeshift shelter. Inside were a sleeping bag, some clothes, and several empty food containers. But what really disturbed Jake was what else he found: a notebook filled with detailed notes about the warehouse complex. Shift changes, delivery schedules, which buildings had the most valuable inventory, and most disturbing of all, detailed notes about Jake himself. The notebook documented Jake's routines down to the minute. What time he made his rounds, how long he spent in each area, when he took his breaks. There were even notes about his personal habits: that he ate sunflower seeds while watching the monitors, that he listened to podcasts on his phone, that he sometimes dozed off around 4 a.m. Jake immediately called his supervisor and the police. By the time they arrived, the campsite had been cleared out. Whoever it was had been watching and had seen Jake discover their hiding spot. The police took a report but said they couldn't do much without catching the person in the act. They increased patrols in the area, but the warehouse complex was on the edge of town and they couldn't monitor it constantly. Jake's supervisor offered to add a second security guard to the night shift, but the company was trying to cut costs and Jake needed the job. He decided to stick with it, but he was much more vigilant about his patrols and started varying his routine so he wouldn't be predictable. For about a week, everything seemed normal. No sign of the mysterious figure on the cameras, no evidence of anyone camping on the property. Jake was starting to think the person had moved on. Then one night around, Jake was in the security office when every single camera feed went black at once. Not static, not a rolling blackout, just black screens across all 12 monitors. He grabbed his flashlight and radio and went outside to investigate. The main power was still on because the building lights were working, so someone had specifically targeted the camera system. As Jake walked toward the equipment shed where the camera controls were housed, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw the figure from the security footage, but now he was much closer, maybe 50 feet away. The person was wearing all black, including a ski mask that covered their face. They were just standing there, not moving, not saying anything. Jake could feel them staring at him even though he couldn't see their eyes. "Hey!" Jake shouted. "You're trespassing on private property. I'm calling the police." The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Jake pulled out his phone to call 911, and that's when the person started walking toward him. Not running, just walking at a steady, deliberate pace. Jake backed toward the security office, keeping his flashlight trained on the figure. His heart was pounding, but he tried to stay calm and professional. He dealt with trespassers before, though never one this creepy. When Jake reached the office door, he fumbled with his keys while keeping the flashlight pointed at the approaching figure. By the time he got the door open, the person was maybe 20 feet away. Jake could see that they were tall and thin, just like in the camera footage, and they moved with an odd, jerky gait that didn't seem natural. Jake slammed the door and immediately called 911. While he was on the phone with the dispatcher, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of someone trying the door handle. The person was right outside the office, slowly turning the handle back and forth. The door was locked, but it was just a standard office door, not exactly high security. If someone really wanted to get in, they could probably break the glass or force the door. Jake told the dispatcher what was happening and begged them to hurry. The dispatcher said units were en route, but it would be at least 10 minutes. 10 minutes of sitting in that office while someone lurked right outside. For the next several minutes, Jake could hear the person moving around outside the building. Footsteps crunching on gravel, the sound of someone testing windows, occasional rattling of the door handle. But the most disturbing part was the silence in between, knowing that someone was out there, but not knowing exactly where. When the police finally arrived, Jake watched through the window as their headlights swept across the parking lot. The figure was nowhere to be seen. A thorough search of the property turned up nothing except the damaged camera equipment. Someone had cut the main cable, disabling the entire system. The police found fresh footprints around the security office and several buildings, confirming that someone had definitely been there. But without more evidence or catching the person in the act, there wasn't much they could do. Jake's company decided the security risk was too high and hired a firm that provided armed guards in teams of 2. Jake was relieved to be off the night shift, but he never found out who had been stalking him or what they wanted. The really disturbing part came a few months later when Jake ran into his replacement. The new security team had found more evidence of someone living on the property, not just camping, but actually living in one of the unused warehouse spaces. They'd set up a small apartment with electricity tapped from the main lines, a makeshift bathroom, and walls covered with surveillance photos. The police investigation revealed that the person had been using the warehouse as a base to stalk multiple people around the city. They never caught him, but the stalking activities stopped after the security upgrade. Jake still works security, but only day shifts now. He says he'll never work alone at night again, and I don't blame him. This third story comes from my Aunt Sarah, who experienced it when she was 32 and moving into her first house after her divorce. It was supposed to be a fresh start for her and my 8-year-old cousin Emma, but it turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. The house was in a nice suburban neighborhood in Beaverton, Oregon. It was a modest 2-bedroom ranch with a big backyard, perfect for a single mom starting over. Sarah had been renting apartments for years, so buying her own house felt like a huge accomplishment. Moving day was a Saturday in early June. Sarah had hired a moving company, but she was doing a lot of the packing and organizing herself to save money. Emma was spending the day with her grandparents so she wouldn't be in the way of the movers. Everything was going smoothly until around 2 p.m. Sarah was in the kitchen unpacking dishes when she heard the front door open and close. She assumed it was one of the movers coming back for another load, but when she called out hello, nobody answered. She walked to the living room and saw a man she didn't recognize standing near her boxes. He was maybe 40 years old, average height, wearing jeans and a plain white t-shirt. He looked completely normal, which somehow made it worse. "Excuse me," Sarah said. "Who are you?" The man smiled at her like they were old friends. "Oh, hi Sarah. I'm Tom. I live next door." He gestured vaguely toward the side of the house. "I just wanted to introduce myself and see if you needed any help." Sarah felt immediately uncomfortable, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Something about his smile seemed forced, and she didn't remember seeing him outside when the movers were working. Also, she hadn't given him permission to just walk into her house. "That's nice of you," she said carefully, "but the movers have everything under control. I think it would be better if you waited until I was more settled in to visit." Tom's smile faltered for just a second. "Oh, come on. We're going to be neighbors. I'm just being friendly." He looked around the room, taking in all her belongings. "Nice place. Really nice." The way he said it made Sarah's skin crawl. There was something possessive about his tone, like he was evaluating her things. "I really need to get back to unpacking," Sarah said firmly. "Maybe we can talk another time." Sure, Tom said, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he walked closer to where she was standing. "You know, if you ever need anything, and I mean anything, I'm right next door. Day or night." He was standing too close now, well within her personal space. Sarah could smell his cologne, something cheap and overpowering. She stepped back toward the kitchen, putting the counter between them. "That's good to know," she said. "Thanks for stopping by." Tom finally headed toward the door, but he paused at the threshold. "Beautiful house for a beautiful woman," he said. "I think we're going to be great friends." After he left, Sarah immediately locked the front door and closed all the blinds. Something about the encounter felt deeply wrong, but she couldn't explain why to herself. He hadn't said anything overtly threatening, but every instinct was telling her to be careful. She called her neighbor on the other side to ask about Tom. The elderly woman who answered said she'd lived there for 15 years and had never heard of anyone named Tom. There was no one living in the house he'd pointed to, and it had been empty for months. Sarah's blood ran cold. She called the police, but when they arrived, they couldn't find any sign of forced entry or evidence that someone had been in the house without permission. Since Tom hadn't stolen anything or made specific threats, there wasn't much they could do except file a report. The movers finished their work around 5 p.m., and Sarah was finally alone in her new house. She picked up Emma from her grandparents' house and tried to act normal, but she was constantly checking the locks and peering out the windows. Around 9 p.m., after Emma was in bed, Sarah was in the living room organizing books when she heard a soft knock at the front door. She looked through the peephole and saw Tom standing on her porch, holding a bottle of wine. Sarah's heart started racing. She didn't answer the door, hoping he would just leave. But the knocking continued, getting more insistent. "Sarah?" Tom called through the door. "I brought you a housewarming gift. Come on, I know you're in there." She stayed silent, crouched down below the level of the window so he couldn't see her if he tried to peer inside. After what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. But Tom didn't leave. Sarah could see his shadow moving around the front of the house. He was walking along the windows, trying to see inside despite the closed blinds. Then she heard him walking around to the back of the house. Sarah grabbed her phone and called 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was prowling around her house and wouldn't leave. She could hear footsteps on her back deck, and then the sound of someone trying the sliding door. The back door was locked, but Tom wasn't giving up. Sarah heard him testing each window, looking for a way in. She ran to Emma's room to make sure she was still asleep and that her window was locked. When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, Tom was gone. They found evidence that someone had been trying to pry open one of the back windows. The screen was damaged and there were scratches around the window frame. The officers took Sarah's statement and increased patrols in the neighborhood, but they couldn't arrest Tom without catching him in the act of actually breaking in. Over the next week, Tom showed up 3 more times. Once during the day while Sarah was at work, her elderly neighbor called to report a strange man walking around Sarah's house and looking in windows. Twice more in the evening, knocking on the door and calling Sarah's name. Each time, Sarah called the police. Each time, Tom was gone by the time they arrived. Sarah was starting to feel like a prisoner in her own home. She had security cameras installed and changed all the locks, but Tom's behavior was escalating. He'd started leaving things on her porch: flowers, notes, small gifts. The notes were getting more personal and disturbing, talking about how he was watching over her and Emma. The breaking point came on a Friday night 2 weeks after moving day. Sarah woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of Emma crying. She ran to her daughter's room and found Emma standing at the window, pointing outside. "There's a man in our yard, Mommy," Emma whispered. Sarah looked out and saw Tom standing in the middle of their backyard, just staring up at the house. He wasn't hiding or trying to break in, he was just standing there in plain sight, like he wanted them to see him. This time, Sarah was ready. She had her phone set to immediately dial 911, and she started recording video through the window. When the police arrived, Tom was still there. They arrested him for trespassing and stalking. During the arrest, police found that Tom had been carrying zip ties, duct tape, and a knife. In his car, they discovered dozens of photos of Sarah and Emma taken without their knowledge, coming and going from the house, at the grocery store, at Emma's school. Tom turned out to be a registered sex offender who had been living in a halfway house several miles away. He'd been watching Sarah's house during the moving process and had become obsessed with her. The neighborly introduction was his way of getting inside to see the layout and figure out the best way to break in later. He pled guilty to stalking and attempted breaking and entering, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Sarah and Emma moved to a different neighborhood before his trial, and they've never gone back to that house. Sarah always tells this story as a warning to trust your instincts. Even when someone seems normal or harmless, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Tom was counting on her being polite and not wanting to seem rude by rejecting his friendly behavior. She says the scariest part wasn't the stalking itself, but how easily he could have talked his way into her house if she hadn't listened to that little voice telling her something wasn't right.